Well, boils and ghouls, it's your old pal, John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Hello, it's Corey, one of your co-hosts of the Horror Heals podcast. I am driving home to see your other co-host Kendall and our menagerie of critters after visiting the TerrorCon in Marlborough, Massachusetts. Now, horror cons for many of us are our happy place. I'm just feeling inspired and thought, okay, why not just record an episode on the drive home? So last night at TerrorCon, as I was making my way around the vendor areas, I saw quite a few booths that were advertising, promoting the fact that it was the 40th anniversary of several iconic horror movies. A Nightmare on Elm Street being one of the main ones. Gremlins, another, although Kendall would argue that Gremlins is not a horror, but I think it is. And it got me thinking about the movies of 1984 and flashed me back to 8-year-old Corey in 1984 when I went on a road trip with my grandma and Grandpa Weiss. Now, a few years before this road trip, Grandma and Grandpa Weiss decided to become full-time truck drivers. And they drove across the country in an 18-wheeler, moving people's furniture from one house to another. I got the fun idea, why don't I go on the road with Grandpa and Grandpa? What fun would that be, right, for an 8-year-old being stuck in the front of a truck for hours at a time while Grandpa drove the highway? I thought it would be a fun adventure. So, Grandma and Grandpa essentially lived in the cab. And their main source of entertainment, aside from a tiny little black and white television that they would watch in the evenings after a long day's drive, was going to the movies. And 1984 had quite a few soon-to-be classics. We saw The Muppets Take Manhattan, which I'm sure was not on the top of their list, but for 8-year-old Corey, it certainly was. I was and remain a diehard Muppets fan. We also saw, I don't know if you would call this a comedy, a musical, but anyway, it was Rhinestone. You may not have even heard of it, but it's the movie in which Dolly Parton, who we adore, teaches Sylvester Stallone how to become a country and western singer. You know, maybe after all, that is a horror movie. And finally, we got to see Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Now, most people would say the Indiana Jones flicks are not horror movies, but definitely have some horror elements to them. Think about all the supernatural stuff that happens in the Indiana Jones flicks. I mean, the end scene of the spirits leaving the Ark of the Covenant in Raiders of the Lost Ark and the melting faces. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Fun stuff, you know, great for an 8-year-old. You've got a kid sidekick. I was all in. Great popcorn movie. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom kickstarted my lifelong fear and fascination with body horror. You might remember about halfway through the flick, the cult leader Mola Ram literally pulls the beating heart out of a sacrifice victim and holds it up, and then it catches on fire. The man is still alive as he goes screaming down into lava. And I was immediately horrified. I was a pretty sensitive kid. My mom says that taking me to the doctor, he would always say, Corey has a nervous tummy. I've always been sort of a fearful person. I hated it when my parents would go next door and hang out and smoke stuff that smelled like Otto's jacket from The Simpsons. So sometimes at night when they would do that, I had a really hard time falling asleep. And I shared a room with my little brother Joey. And so what I would do in order to get us both to fall asleep, or just to get me to fall asleep and probably annoy Joey, was to recite movies that I'd seen over and over and over again. And two of the main ones were Mel Brooks flicks, Blazing Saddles. This was the TV version, by the way, so it didn't have all of stuff going on that the R-rated version did. And then, of course, the classic Young Frankenstein. One of my happiest moments is getting to share that experience with Mel Brooks, who was tickled at the prospect of me reciting his movies to my little 5-year-old brother as we both desperately tried to fall asleep.
I watched it enough over and over that at night when we would go to bed, when my little brother and I still shared a room, we would go to sleep and I would try to recite the movie. I would sing, started off with singing Blazing Saddles, and I would try to go through as many scenes as possible till we fell asleep.
Wow. God bless you. Bless you, Clary. That's beautiful.
Oh no, thank you. That's just kind of just to give you a little inkling of where, my appreciation,
Yeah, you're developing your little nuts, so.
Well, I don't do it anymore.
Yeah, I know. You don't recite it to get to sleep anymore.
Not anymore.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
But anyway, getting back to body horror, okay. Seeing someone's heart get pulled from their chest definitely had an impact on me, which sort of just created in my mind this, I don't know if it was a fear of getting sick or going to the hospital or medical procedures, but I've always been really uncomfortable with horror movies that show scenes of, let's just say, unnecessary surgery. Dr. Satan at the end of Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses, or pretty much all of American Mary. I love the Soska sisters, and they are fantastic filmmakers, but some of their stuff does definitely creep me out. They worship at the feet of the great David Cronenberg, who is, one of the godfathers of modern body horror. Some of his stuff is still difficult for me to watch, but yet I'm fascinated, so I force myself to do it. Sometimes I'll even skip over the Dr. Satan surgery scene at the end of House of a Thousand Corpses, and sometimes I'll force myself to watch it. I'm also not really too crazy about scenes in which people get their faces cut off while they're still alive and somebody else put them on, such as in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. I think it's done really, really well in that one. I mean, I love comedy meets horror aspect of that. I think we've already talked about Texas Chainsaw 2 in another episode. But yeah, Rob Zombie definitely has some sort of fascination with cutting people's faces off and putting them on living people. I don't know where this strange fear of medical stuff and surgery came from. In fact, I've only been really ill one time in my life. That was when I had spinal meningitis about 26, 27 years ago when I was in the hospital. In fact, I'm just now wearing the first cast I've ever had on in my life, and it's a lot of fun hobbling around a horror convention when you've got a cast on. But at least you can, when people ask, what happened to you, you can come up with fun answers like when Eli Roth asked me, I said, oh, don't worry about it. It's just a little flesh-eating bacteria I got. We were camping last weekend in the woods. Or last night, I think I went with simply piranhas. But anyway, back to that trip with Grandma and Grandpa. I didn't last very much longer after seeing Indiana Jones, The Temple of Doom. I don't think it was necessarily because of that heart getting ripped from the chest, but there's not a whole lot of stuff for an 8-year-old to do. They drive across the country for 12 hours a day. And so I convinced my parents to come get me. But I will say the Indiana Jones heart scene wasn't the only horrific thing that happened in that short excursion across the country with Grandma and Grandpa. So as I mentioned, they lived in the cab, and usually I had dinner in the cab and, whatever they were drinking at night. And we would park at a truck stop, and Grandpa kept a bucket nearby in case, he had to take care of business sometime in the middle of the night. Well, I think it was only night 2 or night 3 when I awoke cold and wet. Yes. Somehow I managed to topple Grandpa's pee bucket on top of me and completely covered in that nastiness. So maybe that's where the body horror fear comes from. I'm not sure. But let's continue on this journey of 1984 and the awesome movies within. Gremlins, again, as I said, I find it to be a horror movie. Kendall, not so much. This was one of the movies that my mom took me and my brother and sister to go see. And this isn't necessarily body horror fear, but I was, 8 years old and really kind of creeped out by the story that Phoebe Cates' character tells about why she doesn't like Christmas and discovering her father dressed as Santa trapped in the chimney. And that's how she discovered there was no Santa Claus. I thought that was kind of an odd thing to put into a kid's movie. My sister was only 4 years old in 1984, and for Christmas that year, Dad got her a puppy, and she named that puppy Gizmo. So I'm guessing that maybe she didn't quite get the whole "there is no Santa Claus" reference in Gremlins, but I sure did. Now, I did not see the original Nightmare on Elm Street in 1984. I probably didn't see it until 85 or 86. But I will say the first Nightmare on Elm Street I saw, or at least partially saw, in the theaters was Nightmare on Elm Street 3, which is arguably the second best in that series. This was 1987, and my friend Aaron and I, like a lot of kids in the 80s, would buy a ticket to a matinee and movie hop until the last picture show. Well, on this particular evening, the last picture show just happened to be Nightmare on Elm Street 3. Now, when we were hopping and bopping from theater to theater, there was one usher that kept an eye on us. He knew what we were up to, but I don't think he could quite figure out where we were going. Well, it so happens that we were the only people in A Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3 on that last show, which means there were no tickets sold for that particular showing, which also meant the usher came through to see, do I even need to be running this whole movie? And that's when he found us. So I only got to see up until, I don't know, maybe one death or two. I think we got to see Welcome to Prime Time, Bitch. I know this is a very rambly episode because I'm driving and it's just like stream of consciousness. But one other thing I want to mention, really this absolutely made my day yesterday. It's the kind of thing that's been making Kendall's day and my day since we launched this podcast just a couple of weeks ago. Pretty much daily, we've been getting messages on Instagram from people who discovered the podcast one way or another and are really reaching out to say thank you. And wow, didn't know I needed something like this. Didn't know something like this even existed, but thank you for doing it. Got one of those messages as I was getting ready for the convention last night at my hotel room, and I'm not going to lie, I got a little choked up. It was very, very sweet. And we so appreciate folks who are listening. We're doing this. The whole reason we're doing this is a genuine love for the horror community. And we've all got our anxieties. We've all got our fears. Maybe it's not witnessing someone's beating heart getting ripped from their chest, but we've all got, there are certain types of movies that exhilarate us and make us feel great, and it might be somebody slicing somebody's face off that calms us and gets us ready for a good night's sleep. As I mentioned, the podcast is only a couple of weeks old at this point, and it's really become our passion project. If you have the opportunity, please give us a review on Spotify or Apple. It helps with the algorithms, and it helps those platforms push out podcasts to people who are going to appreciate them. Or just share it with a friend, somebody who likes horror, somebody who doesn't like horror, somebody who's maybe having a tough time. I think when we all share our traumas and experiences and healing, it helps. We really, really appreciate you tuning in to the podcast. Please remember, when someone questions, is horror good for mental health? You tell them, of course it is. The Horror Heals podcast is produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.